Hello, this is the Arts Hour on the BBC World Service. I'm Nikki Beattie, here with 60 minutes of the best global arts and culture conversation from across the BBC. My guests on the Arts Hour today are poet Choman Hardi, and we're going to talk about your poetry now, Choman. So you were born in Kurdistan. You lived both in Iran and Iraq during the time that Saddam Hussein launched his genocide campaign against the Kurdish people, which included using chemical weapons and chemicals. And then you sought asylum in the UK. Considering the Women, which is your most recent collection of poetry, tell me who these women are you want us to consider.
Right. The collection, as you mentioned, the center of the collection is a sequence of poems called Anfal, which is about the genocide survivors telling their stories.
And just tell us what Anfal means, because it's actually a chapter in the Quran, isn't it?
That's right. It's the 8th chapter of the Quran, Al-Anfal, and it means the spoils of war. Now, this came down to the Prophet in the context of his first war against non-believers. The Iraqi government used this for a campaign against Kurds who were actually Muslim. So they were considered spoils of war. And the campaign happened as an escalation of violence towards the Kurds because, especially the rural community, they were supporting the Kurdish resistance, and the former Iraqi state punished them through gassing and genocide. So the central sequence in Considering the Woman is about these survivors, the voices of survivors. But there are many other stories about women speaking. Honor killing is another theme. Exile is a theme. Trying to survive in a post-conflict society is another theme where many of the gender stereotypes are reinforced and become re-emphasized after the conflict has passed, and you end up with a very brutalized and sometimes a community where violence has become normal, and a big part of that is violence towards women. So the book tries to give voice to women's experiences during and in the aftermath of conflict.
Now, you spent quite a lot of time researching these survivors. And initially this was for your postdoctorate work, but then you decided to create a collection of poems that had those women at the heart of them. What made you want to tell their stories through poetry?
I got a scholarship from the Leverhulme Trust for this research, and I knew I wanted to write an academic book, which I did. It took 5 years. It was a very traumatic thing to have undertaken. But while I was doing the research, I was also, some sentences that the woman said, I would immediately think, this is the start of a poem. This sentence, like one of the poems goes, you do not die, not when you want to. And this was a sentence said by a woman. So basically, throughout the field work I was doing and writing up the research, the academic research, I knew that there was poetry to be made out of this. But, you know, I mean, it took 7 years to complete these poems. The first versions were very emotional and angry and not, they were very raw. And they were too much in your face, shouting in a way. And I knew I had to really sort of step back, and I had to let the stories speak without being very passionate, because they were already very traumatic in themselves. So it's also coming back to the ambivalence of, you know, inhabiting other people's lives or stories. I mean, as long as you don't steal other people's stories in order to make fortune for yourself.
Yes.
And you're...
So, for example, you just gave the example of the first line of your poem, and when the woman is saying, you do not die even if you want to. That poem then goes on to say what she had to see,
yes,
what she had to cope with in terms of the people killed in front of her, the people she lost, and the way that they were killed.
Right.
And so, as a reader and someone who is being invited into your world to see what these people went through, that was incredibly powerful, but it was also... It was not over sentimentalized.
Right.
Like you've just said, you pulled back from anything that was really angry and emotional. Is that why you chose to use such very, very simple language?
Absolutely. I think, well, the arts in general are a very good way of creating empathy. In post-conflict societies where empathy and sympathy and safe spaces have disappeared, I think the arts can do a great deal there. I think we generally, if something is very emotional in our face, even if someone is making a good argument, we usually shut off. And I think the stories themselves were already tragic enough, and they speak for themselves. So that's why I thought I had to pare down the language and make it as understated as I could.
Will you read one of your poems for us?
Yes, so there are several themes in the poem. So some of them have survived gassing and are dying of cancer, these women. Some of them are experiencing a lot of injustice in the aftermath of the genocide because they become very poor widows who have to look after their children in a society that's very brutally patriarchal. And some of them are also searching for closure, because the bodies of their loved ones are still covered in mass graves somewhere in the south or west of Iraq. And they all say, as long as they can have a body that they can put to rest and put in a grave, that's when they can let go. So this poem is about two women fighting over the remains of a 14-year-old boy. Dispute over a mass grave. The one you have finished examining is my son. That is the milky-coloured Kurdish suit his father tailored for him, the blue shirt his uncle gave to him. Your findings prove that it is him. He was a tall 14-year-old, was left-handed, had broken a rib. I know she too has been looking for her son, but you have to tell her that this is not him. Yes, the two of them were playmates and fought the year before, but it was my son who broke a rib. Hers only feigned to escape trouble. That one is mine. Please give him back to me. I will bury him on the verge of my garden. The mulberry tree will offer him its shadow. The flowers will earnestly guard his grave. The hens will peck on his gravestone, and the beehive will hum above his head.
Beautiful, but also so incredibly sad and tragic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Considering the Women is available now, published by Blood Axe, and Choman is discussing her work at the 21st anniversary of the Ledbury Poetry Festival. Don't go away, there's lots more to come, and the Arts Hour's back after this. Welcome back to the Arts Hour on the BBC World Service with me, Nikki Bailey. And if you've only just joined us, here's what you missed but can always listen back to online. My studio guest, Kurdish poet Choman Hardi, talked about Considering the Women, her latest anthology of work. Choman, what do you think about using dispassionate and factual language when telling a shocking story? I mean, that's what you've done in your poetry.
I think these are sort of choices that we make as writers, and some writers argue that why are we so scared of emotion? Is it because emotions are usually associated with women and femininity, that masculine have decided that it has to be logical and very toned down language? On the other hand, I think when your subject matter is so tragic and so emotionally difficult to cope with, then dispassionate language does work. In my experience, that works. So I agree.
Do you think neuroticism is essential to a novel?
Well, I think extreme negative emotions seem to turn people into writers. You know, I mean, most people, when they're heartbroken or they're experiencing grief or they're in exile, they turn to writing. Even if they don't continue as writers, they find some creative force in it. And I guess when you're content and everything is well and going well and you feel calm, there seems to be less urge to write. But I think as serious writers, you should be able to write out of happiness or sadness. I mean, that's who you are. Writing is your language. But of course, at times of crisis, most people turn to creativity. Always helps.
Choman, did you have role models? Was there a poet that inspired you?
Yes. Of course. I think feminists have long argued, haven't they, that you can't be what you can't see. And if you can't see people of your gender, of your race, of your group, whatever, however you identify, doing things, then you don't think you can do them yourself. So when I was growing up, I used to know a lot of poetry by heart, but majority of it was by old men, and including my own father. And I loved poetry, but it was nothing that I thought I can do. I wasn't interested in that kind of poetry until when I was a teenager, I started reading Forough Farrokhzad, a Persian woman poet, and later Kajal Ahmed, a Kurdish woman poet. That's when I realized, I can do this. And I love this. They're saying what I'm feeling. They're saying what I'm thinking. So that was a huge door opening for me. But I was very much interested in what Carla Marie Williams said about this group that she set up, women supporting each other and being positive on opportunities, because we know that one of the mechanisms of patriarchy is to divide women against each other so that they compete, they gossip about each other, they never encourage each other. And men don't have to do that because women do it themselves. So creating any space where oppressed, marginalized groups can unite, can give each other support and be positive is excellent.
Now, every week I like to ask my guests for a recommendation, whatever you would like to recommend, not just to me, but for everyone listening to the BBC World Service right now. So, Choman, let me come to you.
Well, there's a poet whose poem I have translated, and it's available online. It's about exile. It's beautiful, full of imagery, lovely language, very playful. I translated him with the Poetry Translation Center, so it will be on their website, and it's called An Afternoon at Snowfall by the poet Dilawar Qaradaghi.
So, An Afternoon at Snowfall.
An Afternoon at Snowfall.
Thank you to my guest today, Choman Hardi, and thank you for your company on this week's Arts Hour. Don't forget you can be in touch with me and the show via email, theartshour@bbc.co.uk. Also, details and information about this week's show are on the website, bbcworldservice.com/artshour. For now, from me, Nikki Beattie, and producer Philippa Ritchie, see you next week.